Welcome to Psycast. Today I want to talk to you about something that might feel almost contradictory. What if the path to motivation wasn't about making things easier, but about falling in love with what's hard? Not for the sake of suffering, but because your brain and your life can change when effort becomes the reward. Let's talk about how rewiring your dopamine system might not just make you work harder, but make you feel more alive while doing it. We often think of dopamine as the molecule of pleasure, the thing that lights up when we get what we want. But that's only a part of the story. Dopamine is less about reward and more about pursuit. It's what gives energy to our striving. And that changes everything. Because if your brain only releases dopamine when you reach the finish line, then everything in between becomes a chore. But if your brain learns to release dopamine during the process, during the effort, the struggle, the doing, then suddenly, hard work isn't something you suffer through. It becomes something you crave. Not because it's easy, but because your brain starts to love the climb more than the peak. Dr. Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist at Stanford, talks about this with remarkable clarity. He explains that the dopamine system isn't fixed, it's trainable. And the key isn't found in shortcuts or rewards. It's found in a shift of attention. When we consciously associate dopamine not with the outcome, but with the effort itself, the brain begins to reinforce the work. For example, instead of telling yourself, "I'll feel good once this is done," you start telling yourself, "This part, the doing, the challenge, this is what feels good." And it's not just mental trickery. Over time, your brain rewires its reward pathways to match this new narrative. The struggle becomes a source of strength. The effort, a source of pride. There's something deeply human about this. We're wired to grow through resistance. Just like a muscle needs tension to become stronger, the mind needs challenge to expand. But modern life has confused us. We've been sold the idea that happiness is found in ease, that the good life is one without friction. Yet the truth is, most people feel most alive not when things are comfortable, but when they're in motion. When they're working towards something that matters, even if it's hard. Especially when it's hard, because the effort becomes evidence that we're capable, that we're alive, that we haven't given up. Let me tell you something I once heard that stayed with me. The pain of effort is never wasted if it's consciously chosen. When you choose your struggle, when you own it, it stops being suffering. It becomes something else, something meaningful. And your brain, through the plasticity of dopamine, begins to reinforce that meaning. This is why some people become addicted to growth. Not in a toxic way, but in a deeply fulfilling one. They've trained their system to find joy, not just in arrival, but in becoming. There's a kind of quiet power in this, in learning to feel good, not when the work is over, but while it's unfolding. Because life is mostly process. Most of it happens in the middle, between beginnings and endings. If your sense of fulfillment is only triggered at the finish line, you'll spend most of your time restless, distracted, or numb. But if you can anchor your motivation in the moment-to-moment effort, if you can learn to find satisfaction in showing up, trying again, pushing through, then every day becomes meaningful, even when it's mundane. This idea isn't just neuroscience. It echoes through philosophy too. The Stoic thinkers, especially Epictetus and Seneca, often spoke about the discipline of desire, not eliminating it, but directing it. They understood that craving outcomes leads to suffering, because outcomes are uncertain. But if you can train your desire toward the process, toward doing your part with excellence regardless of the result, then you free yourself from that suffering. This is not a call to apathy. It's the opposite. It's a call to care deeply, but wisely, to pour yourself into your actions without being enslaved by the outcome. It's a way of living with purpose and freedom at the same time. And this is where modern science and ancient wisdom shake hands. Because dopamine, when paired with intention, can become a tool for liberation. According to Huberman, one of the most powerful ways to rewire your reward system is through what he calls dopamine layering. It means becoming aware of what you're associating pleasure with and consciously shifting that association. So instead of pairing dopamine with passive consumption, like scrolling or snacking or escaping, you begin to pair it with effort, with discipline, with small wins in the direction of something bigger. And over time, This repetition creates a feedback loop. Your brain starts to want the work because the work is what now brings the internal reward. But let me be honest, this isn't instant. It's not a hack. It's a practice. Some days it will feel unnatural. Your old patterns will whisper that you deserve a break, that it's not worth it, that ease is the goal. But if you can stay with the discomfort, if you can remind yourself that you're rewiring your own system, that you're choosing growth over gratification, you begin to tap into something steady, something deeper than hype or hustle, a kind of grounded motivation that doesn't depend on mood or momentum, just presence, just a willingness to be in the work without needing it to be easy. It's the kind of strength that grows slowly, quietly, day after day. It's not loud. It doesn't always look impressive, but it builds something that can't be faked, a genuine love for becoming. Not because you're not enough as you are, but because there's something sacred about moving toward your potential with your whole heart. Not to prove anything, but to feel what it means to be alive. Sometimes I think we misunderstand what motivation really is. We wait for it like weather, hoping it shows up, hoping it lasts. But motivation isn't a mood. It's a relationship. And like any relationship, it deepens through consistency, not convenience. This is why rewiring your dopamine system is such a powerful shift. It doesn't just give you more drive, it gives you a different kind of drive. One that's not dependent on novelty or praise. One that comes from within, even when no one's watching, especially then. Brené Brown once said, "Joy is not a constant. It comes to us in moments, often ordinary moments." I think the same is true for motivation. When we learn to find it not in the highlight reel, but in the repetition, in the act of choosing to show up again, we realize that what we used to call discipline was never really about restriction. It was about love. Love for your future self. Love for the work, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because that's when you're most alive, when you're stretching, sweating, failing, trying again. And it's in those small, unglamorous moments. Waking up early when it would be easier to sleep in. Staying with a task when your mind wants to flee. Choosing depth over distraction. That your system starts to shift. Your brain, quietly and steadily, begins to fire dopamine not at the end of the task, but in the middle of the effort. And suddenly, progress feels good. Not because you're done, but because you're doing it. You're in motion. You're growing. This is why Huberman emphasizes the idea of non-contingent dopamine, the kind that doesn't rely on external validation. He explains that when we reserve our pleasure only for outcomes, we become addicts to results. But when we learn to generate dopamine internally, by appreciating the process, by celebrating effort, by noticing small wins, we create a source of motivation that no failure can take away. Because even when you don't win, you've grown. Even when the result isn't what you hoped, the work wasn't wasted. You became stronger. You stayed in the fire. I remember reading a passage from Viktor Frankl that changed how I see all of this. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." That's the essence of this journey. It's not just about working harder. It's about working from a different place, from within, from presence, from purpose. The work becomes a mirror, showing you not just what you can achieve, but who you're becoming in the process. And maybe that's the real goal, not the dopamine hit, not the applause, but the quiet transformation that happens when you fall in love with showing up for your life. Not just the easy parts, but all of it. The messy, uncertain, beautifully human parts, too. There's a subtle but life-changing difference between chasing rewards and becoming someone who honors the effort itself. One is a loop of highs and crashes, of burning bright and then burning out. The other is a path of quiet endurance, built on the kind of motivation that doesn't scream, but hums, steady and true. When you rewire your dopamine system to love the process, you're not just training your brain. You're reclaiming your time, your energy, your sovereignty. You're stepping out of a culture that tells you to chase outcomes and into a way of being that values who you are while you're in the making. Let me paint you a scene. Imagine someone running in the rain, not for a race, not for a medal, but because the movement itself feels like a kind of prayer. because they found a rhythm in the discomfort, and the sound of their breath reminds them they're alive. That's what it looks like when the system is rewired. Or think of someone working late into the night on something no one sees, not for applause, but because they care. Because building something from nothing gives their life a sense of shape, a direction. This is not martyrdom, it's devotion, not to suffering, but to meaning. And this rewiring process, this shift in where the brain finds its pleasure, doesn't require perfection. In fact, it feeds on the small, consistent choices. Choosing to begin again after distraction. Choosing to stay with the task 1 minute longer than you want to. Choosing to acknowledge yourself, not for what you finished, but for the fact that you showed up. This builds something profound. Because every time you reinforce effort with a small internal reward, a breath, a word of encouragement, a sense of pride, you're reshaping how your brain sees the world. You're saying, this matters. I matter. Not because I finished, but because I cared enough to try. Carl Jung once said, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. I think part of rewiring the dopamine system is this act of looking inward, not to escape the world, but to change how we move through it, to stop outsourcing our motivation to the next big thing and instead root it in the quiet dignity of effort. Because when the doing becomes the reward, your life no longer hangs on what happens after. You're free. Free to enjoy the work even when it's slow. Free to rest without guilt. Free to live a life measured not by speed or scale, but by depth. And the beauty of this shift is that it's always available, no matter where you are, no matter how long you've been stuck in cycles of distraction or avoidance. The brain is plastic. It can change. You are not broken. You are not lazy. You've just been feeding a system that was never built to sustain you. But today, you can begin again. You can teach your brain to love what builds you, not what numbs you. And that love, quiet, resilient, honest, will carry you further than any burst of hype ever could. There's a stillness that comes when you stop needing every moment to be thrilling, when you begin to see effort itself as a kind of sanctuary. This isn't about grinding endlessly or forcing joy where there is none. It's about tuning into something quieter but far more powerful, the integrity of showing up for your own life. That moment when you're tired but you keep going, not because anyone's watching, but because you made a promise to yourself. That's where the rewiring begins to feel like returning, not to someone new, but to who you were always meant to be before the noise got loud. The more I sit with this, the more I believe that true discipline isn't about punishment. It's about intimacy with your own values, your own energy, your own sense of meaning. It's the art of listening deeply to what matters most and aligning your actions with it, even when it's inconvenient. And when you begin to associate effort with identity, when the work becomes not just something you do, but part of who you are, motivation becomes less of a struggle. You don't have to force yourself. You just follow through because it feels like alignment. And maybe that's what we're all looking for. Not just achievement, but alignment. A life where our inner values and outer actions begin to match. A life where hard work doesn't deplete us, but grounds us. Where dopamine isn't hijacked by shallow pleasures, but devoted to deep growth. That's the gift of this rewiring. It doesn't make the work easier. It makes it meaningful. It doesn't erase the effort. It sanctifies it. James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, once said, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." And the dopamine system, when trained gently, with consistency and care, becomes one of the most powerful systems we can build, not just to accomplish more, but to live more honestly, to anchor joy in the present, not in the distant reward, to find beauty in repetition, to become someone who doesn't just dream, but returns to the path again and again with quiet devotion. So if you've been waiting for motivation to strike, maybe this is your invitation to stop waiting. Maybe the moment you begin is the moment the brain begins to change. And maybe, just maybe, every time you choose the effort, with awareness, with presence, with a whisper of pride, you're writing a new story into your nervous system. One where you no longer need to chase every high, because the high is already here. In the becoming, in the trying, in the sacred ordinary work of being fully alive.